Lady Eleanor Hartley stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers smoothing the pale rose silk of her gown for the third time in as many minutes, and she told herself that the nervous flutter in her chest was merely anticipation rather than hope, though she knew herself well enough to recognize the lie. The crystal chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms cast their golden light over the most exclusive gathering in all of London, illuminating silk gowns that cost more than many families earned in a year and jewels that caught the light like captured stars, while the orchestra played a Strauss waltz that made the very air seem to shimmer with possibility. Eleanor inhaled deeply, catching the mingled scents of beeswax candles, expensive French perfume, and something else she could not quite name, but recognized instinctively as the smell of ambition, of matrimonial hope, of young ladies and their mammas all waiting for that one perfect moment that would secure their futures. The 7 patronesses of Almack's sat in their gilt chairs along the wall like judges at an invisible court, their sharp eyes missing nothing, their approval or disapproval capable of making or destroying a reputation with a single glance. And Eleanor was acutely aware that they had opened the doors at precisely 11 o'clock, as they always did, turning away even dukes and princes who arrived so much as a minute late. For at Almack's the rules were absolute, and social standing meant nothing if one could not follow them. Her mother leaned close, the urgency in her whisper barely concealed beneath a veneer of maternal concern, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of expectation settle across her shoulders like an invisible shawl. "There he is, darling," her mother breathed, her fan fluttering with barely suppressed excitement. "Stand straight, smile but not too broadly. Remember you are the daughter of an earl, and you must act as though you expect his attention rather than hoping for it." Eleanor resisted the urge to roll her eyes at this oft-repeated instruction, instead replying softly, "Mamma, please. He may not even approach," though even as she spoke the words she felt her heart betray her with its quickening rhythm. She had met James Rothwell, the Duke of Ashford, exactly 4 times at various social functions over the past 6 weeks, and each time he had seemed attentive in a way that made her think perhaps, just perhaps, he saw her as more than merely another eligible young lady in a sea of pale muslins and practiced smiles. He was 27 to her 23, possessed of a fortune that made even the wealthiest families in London look modest by comparison, and blessed with the kind of aristocratic good looks that made debutantes stumble over their carefully rehearsed conversations. Yet when he had spoken with Eleanor at Lady Pemberton's musicale, he had asked her opinion on the performance rather than simply complimenting her gown, and that small gesture of respect had lodged itself in her chest like a warm coal. Now, as she watched the couples swirl across the polished floor in their elegant patterns, she allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of imagining herself among them, her hand in his, her future suddenly bright with promise, instead of shadowed by the creeping fear that 23 was perilously close to being permanently on the shelf. The great doors of Almack's opened once more, and a subtle shift rippled through the assembly, the kind of collective awareness that occurs when someone of true consequence enters a room, and Eleanor found her gaze drawn inexorably toward the entrance, where James Rothwell, Duke of Ashford, stood surveying the ballroom with the calm assurance of a man who had never in his life questioned his welcome anywhere. He was tall, perhaps a full head taller than most men present, with dark hair that gleamed almost black in the candlelight, and eyes of such a striking green that Eleanor had once heard a young lady compare them to emeralds, though she privately thought they were more like the sea before a storm, changeable and deep and slightly dangerous. His evening attire was impeccable, all black, superfine wool and crisp white linen, cut to emphasize the breadth of his shoulders and the lean athleticism of a man who rode and fenced and did not spend all his days in idle luxury, and beside him Lord Peter Bancroft looked almost diminished, despite being a handsome man in his own right, for the Duke possessed that indefinable quality that drew every eye without apparent effort. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as his gaze swept the room with methodical purpose, passing over clusters of hopeful debutantes and their mammas, skimming past the patronesses with a polite nod of acknowledgement, and then landing directly on her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed, as though he could see past the carefully arranged silk and practiced poise to the nervous young woman beneath. Around her the whispers began immediately, that peculiar phenomenon of drawing rooms and ballrooms where news travelled faster than sound should allow, and she heard the words spoken behind fans and gloved hands even as she tried to focus on maintaining her composure. "The Duke is approaching the Hartley girl," someone murmured with a note of surprise, and Eleanor felt her mother's fingers dig into her arm with barely suppressed triumph, the grip tight enough to leave marks that would bloom purple by morning. Her palms grew damp inside her evening gloves, and she prayed desperately that he would not notice when he took her hand, for there was nothing quite so mortifying as clammy palms during a first dance, and she could feel the weight of dozens of gazes upon her as he began walking in her direction with clear and unmistakable purpose. Other young ladies watched with expressions ranging from envy to frank curiosity, their careful social masks slipping just enough to reveal the disappointment or fascination beneath, while their mammas leaned toward each other behind rapidly fluttering fans, already calculating what this attention might mean for their own daughters' prospects. The orchestra was transitioning to a new piece, the notes hanging in the air like a question awaiting its answer, and the ballroom seemed to hush in that peculiar way that crowds do when they sense something significant is about to occur, as though all of London society was collectively holding its breath. Lord Bancroft's voice carried across the diminishing space between them, pitched just loud enough for nearby listeners to hear, his tone carrying a hint of amusement as he said, "Going to claim your dance, Ashford?" The Duke nodded in response, but his expression remained unreadable, formal in a way that Eleanor could not quite interpret, his mouth set in a line that was neither smile nor frown, but something carefully neutral, and as he drew closer she could see that his green eyes held an emotion she could not name, something that sent a small shiver of unease down her spine even as her heart continued its traitorous pounding. The room held its breath, and Eleanor held hers with it, standing as straight as her mother had instructed, her smile practiced but genuine, her entire future seeming to balance on whatever words would come next. The Duke of Ashford stopped directly before Eleanor and her mother, his polished boots coming to rest on the gleaming parquet floor, with a finality that seemed to echo through the sudden silence, and he executed a bow of such perfect formality that it should have been reassuring, but instead felt oddly cold, like the proper gesture performed without any warmth behind it. Eleanor began her curtsy in response, her body moving through the practiced motion with automatic grace, even as her heart soared with anticipation, already imagining the feel of his hand at her waist as they moved through the waltz, already composing in her mind the careful responses she would give to the inevitable questions about their dance that would follow, and she was halfway through the dip when his voice cut through her dreams like a blade through silk. "Lady Eleanor, Lady Hartley," he said, his tone as formal and impersonal as his bow had been, each word enunciated with aristocratic precision. "I must respectfully decline to dance this evening." The words hung in the air, and for a heartbeat Eleanor thought she had misheard, that surely he had said something else entirely. But then he continued, and each syllable fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of destruction outward in ever-widening circles. "I fear I have given the wrong impression of my intentions," he stated, as though he were discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the refreshments rather than destroying a young woman's reputation before the most influential gathering in London. I have no wish to court Lady Eleanor, and I would not mislead her or this company further. My apologies." He bowed again with that same perfect formality, and then he simply walked away, his broad shoulders disappearing back into the crowd, as though nothing of consequence had occurred, as though he had not just shattered Eleanor's world into fragments too small to ever piece back together. Eleanor froze mid-curtsy, caught in that awkward half-bent position like a puppet whose strings had been suddenly cut. And she felt the blood drain from her face so rapidly that for a moment she thought she might actually faint. Though some stubborn core of pride kept her upright, even as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her mother gasped audibly beside her, a sound of shock and horror that would have been comical in any other context, and around them the whispers that had been merely curious moments before exploded into a roar of scandal that filled the ballroom like floodwater. Eleanor felt as though the floor had opened beneath her feet, and she was falling into some dark abyss where every eye in London watched her descent with fascination, and humiliation burned through her veins like fire, hot and consuming, and absolutely inescapable. Her hands began to tremble inside her gloves, and she clasped them together to still the shaking. But it was useless. Her entire body had begun to betray her with its physical manifestation of her internal devastation. The golden ballroom that had seemed so full of promise mere moments ago transformed into a nightmare of gilt and candlelight, every beautiful surface now reflecting back her disgrace, every gleaming chandelier illuminating her humiliation for all to see. Every eye in Almack's fixed upon her with the avid attention that society reserves for its most delicious scandals. And even the orchestra seemed affected, continuing to play, but with several musicians missing notes as they craned their necks to observe the spectacle. Lady Jersey, seated among the other patronesses, raised her quizzing glass to her eye with deliberate slowness, examining Eleanor as one might examine an unusual insect, and Eleanor felt that scrutiny like a physical touch. "What have you done?" her mother hissed in her ear, her voice sharp with panic and accusation. What did you do to offend him, as though Eleanor's behavior must surely be the cause of such an unprecedented slight, as though she must have committed some terrible faux pas to deserve this public rejection? Eleanor could barely force the words past her constricted throat, her voice emerging as little more than a whisper. "Nothing, Mamma. I have done nothing." But even to her own ears it sounded like a plea rather than a statement of fact. Nearby, a young lady in white muslin leaned toward her companion and stage-whispered with poorly concealed delight, "How mortifying! Refused at Almack's of all places, she will never recover from this." And the words carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity, ensuring that Eleanor heard every syllable of her own social execution. Eleanor forced herself to remain standing through sheer force of will, calling upon reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, and with tremendous effort that left her feeling as though she were holding herself together with nothing more substantial than spider silk and pride. She kept her expression composed despite the maelstrom of humiliation raging beneath the surface. She turned to her mother with a calmness that was purely performative, a mask she pulled over her shattered heart, and said quietly enough that only her mother could hear, "I wish to leave Mamma now," and those 4 words carried more dignity than any protest or tears could have conveyed. Her mother, pale as milk and with fury radiating from every line of her rigid posture, gave a single sharp nod of agreement. And together they moved toward the entrance with measured steps that belied the desperate urge to run that clawed at Eleanor's chest. They collected their cloaks from the attendants whose eyes held that particular mix of pity and fascination that servants reserve for the downfall of their betters, and Eleanor kept her chin high as they descended the steps of Almack's, though tears blurred her vision until the gas lamps along the street became nothing more than golden smears against the darkness. Inside she felt not merely rejected, but fundamentally shattered. For it was not simply the refusal itself that devastated her, but the calculated public cruelty of it, the deliberate choice to approach her before all of society only to refuse her. And the question that tormented her most was why? Why would he walk across that ballroom with such clear purpose if his intention was only to humiliate her before everyone who mattered? The carriage ride home through the dark London streets felt interminable, each turn of the wheels carrying her further from the glittering ballroom and deeper into a darkness that felt both literal and metaphorical. And the gas lamps created pools of light at regular intervals that illuminated nothing but her own misery reflected in the carriage window. The interior of the vehicle felt suffocating despite its spacious design, the air thick with unshed tears and unspoken recriminations, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of the contrast between this dark private space and the golden public one she had just fled, as though her emotional descent from hope to devastation had been made manifest in the physical journey from light into shadow. Her mother sat rigid across from her, alternating between rage and despair with such rapidity that Eleanor might have found it almost amusing had she been capable of finding anything amusing in this moment. And finally, in the privacy of the carriage, Eleanor allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall, silent and hot against her cheeks. Though she made no sound, because even now she would not give voice to her pain. "We must withdraw to the country immediately," her mother declared with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You cannot show your face in London after this disgrace. The entire season is ruined. Your prospects are destroyed." And the litany of doom continued until Eleanor felt she might scream from the suffocating weight of it all. Instead, she found within herself a core of steel she had not known existed, forged perhaps in the fires of that very public humiliation, and she replied with surprising firmness that cut through her mother's spiraling panic like a knife through butter. "I have done nothing disgraceful, Mamma," she said, and each word was enunciated with perfect clarity, despite the tears still sliding down her face. The Duke's behavior was disgraceful, his choice to publicly refuse me without cause or explanation, his cruelty in approaching me at all if his intention was only to reject me before all of society. Eleanor felt her spine straighten as she spoke, felt something shifting inside her from victim to someone who would not accept that role without challenge. "I will not hide as though I am at fault," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I will not retreat to the country and cower as though I have committed some terrible sin when my only crime was accepting the attention of a man who proved himself unworthy of the courtesy I showed him." Her mother stared at her, as though seeing her daughter clearly for the first time, and in the flickering light of the passing gas lamps, Eleanor felt the first stirring of something beyond humiliation, a fierce determination that she would not allow the Duke of Ashford to define her worth or destroy her spirit, no matter how thoroughly he had attempted to accomplish both before the judging eyes of London's elite. James Rothwell sat alone in his study as the mantel clock struck 2 in the morning, the glass of brandy on the table beside him untouched despite having been poured hours ago, and he found himself replaying the scene at Almack's with the kind of obsessive repetition that only guilt and regret can inspire. He saw it all again with terrible clarity, the way Eleanor's face had transformed in the space of a heartbeat, from cautious hope to confusion to dawning horror, the precise moment when comprehension had flooded those amber eyes and turned them from warm to devastated. And the memory of that transformation felt like a physical blow to his chest that left him struggling to breathe. He dropped his head into his hands and pressed his palms against his eyes as though he could somehow erase the image burned into his mind. And the question that tormented him echoed through his thoughts with relentless persistence. What have I done? What in God's name have I done? James was tormented in a way he had not been since his father's death 5 years prior. That same gnawing sensation of having committed an act that could not be undone, no matter how desperately one wished to turn back time, and he acknowledged with bitter honesty that he had his reasons for behaving as he did. He always had reasons for his careful control, his methodical approach to every aspect of his life, including and especially matters of the heart. He had convinced himself over the past week that a clean break was necessary, that Lady Eleanor had begun to develop expectations based on his attentions, and that the honourable course was to make his lack of intentions absolutely clear before those expectations could deepen into something more painful. But seeing her devastation tonight had undone something fundamental in him, had cracked open the careful walls he maintained around his emotions and allowed him to see his actions for what they truly were. The look in her amber eyes would haunt him, he knew, perhaps for the rest of his life, that particular expression of betrayal and confusion that suggested she could not comprehend what she had done to deserve such treatment. And the terrible truth was that she had done nothing, absolutely nothing, except be kind and intelligent and gently hopeful in a way that had terrified him into cruelty. He stood abruptly and began to pace the length of his study like a caged animal, his footsteps muffled by the thick Turkish carpet, and with each turn he felt the weight of his error pressing down upon him with increasing force, until he thought he might collapse beneath it. He had convinced himself that a public declaration would prevent false hope, would make his position so clear that there could be no misunderstanding or lingering expectations. But now he realized with sickening clarity that what he had actually accomplished was the complete and utter destruction of an innocent woman's reputation before the most influential gathering in London. The study around him was all dark panelled wood and leather-bound books, masculine and orderly in the way that everything in his life was orderly. For James Rothwell prided himself on control and precision in all things. But tonight, that order felt oppressive rather than comforting, cold rather than reassuring, as though the very walls were judging him and finding him wanting. A fire burned low in the grate, throwing dancing shadows across the room, and outside his windows, London was silent in the way that only the very late night or very early morning can be, that peculiar hush when even the great city seems to pause and take breath. The door to his study opened without knock or warning, and Lord Peter Bancroft entered, for he had followed James home from Almack's and had apparently been waiting in the drawing-room for his friend to summon him, though no summons had come because James could not bear to face even his oldest friend after what he had done. "That was brutally done, James," Bancroft said without preamble, his voice carrying none of its usual lightness. "Even for you," and the words hung in the air like an indictment. "I know," James replied, his voice rough as though he had been shouting rather than sitting in silence. "God help me, I know. I thought I was being honourable, clear. I thought a decisive break would be kinder in the long run than allowing false hope to flourish. But instead, I destroyed her before all of society. I saw it in her face, Peter, the exact moment when I broke something in her." Bancroft moved to the sideboard and poured himself the brandy that James had ignored, taking a long swallow before responding. "Then you must make amends," he said simply, as though the solution were obvious. James laughed, a bitter sound without humour. "How does one make amends for that?" he asked. "How does one apologize for deliberately humiliating someone before everyone who matters, for crushing hope and reputation simultaneously? Tell me, Peter, because I cannot fathom it." Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of her bedroom at Hartley House with the kind of cruel brightness that seemed to mock the darkness of her situation. And for one blessed moment, before full consciousness returned, she did not remember the previous evening. But then memory crashed over her like a wave, and she felt the humiliation anew as though the Duke's words were being spoken again in the present rather than residing in the terrible past. Her lady's maid, Mary, entered quietly, bearing both the morning newspapers and a breakfast tray, and Eleanor could read the truth of her disgrace in the way the girl's eyes refused to meet hers directly. That particular combination of pity and embarrassment that servants display when their mistress has fallen from grace. The gossip columns had worked with their characteristic speed and viciousness, transforming the previous night's events into printed scandal that would outlive memory, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the Morning Post to find her ruin documented in stark black ink. Duke of Ashford publicly declines to dance with Lady E.H. at Almack's, a most extraordinary slight, the column declared with the breathless enthusiasm that society reporters reserve for their most delicious scandals, and it continued with speculation about what offence Lady Eleanor might have committed to warrant such treatment, as though her guilt must be assumed rather than her innocence. Letters had already begun arriving in the Morning Post, carried up by footmen whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to carefully neutral, and Eleanor sorted through them with growing horror as the full scope of her social destruction became apparent. Some were sympathetic in that particular way that is almost worse than outright cruelty, dripping with pity and barely concealed satisfaction that it was Eleanor rather than the writer who had suffered such a fate, while many others were withdrawing invitations to upcoming events with various transparent excuses that could not disguise their true purpose. Lady Pemberton regretted that her musicale was now to be a much smaller affair than previously planned. The Duchess of Somerset discovered that her niece would be occupying the seat originally reserved for Eleanor at her dinner party, and Mrs. Carrington found that her country house party was quite suddenly filled to capacity, and each letter was another door closing in Eleanor's face, another confirmation that London society had judged her and found her somehow wanting. Eleanor read the papers and letters with growing horror, her social ruin now preserved in print and made permanent in a way that mere gossip could never achieve, and she felt physically sick as the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. But she forced herself to pick up her fork and eat the breakfast that Mary had brought, swallowing each bite with determination, even though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She would not collapse. She told herself with fierce insistence she would not give society the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed, would not allow the Duke of Ashford or anyone else to believe that they had broken her beyond repair. The morning light flooded her feminine bedroom with its pale yellows and whites, colors chosen years ago to suggest innocence and youth, and all the qualities that made young ladies marriageable. But now that light felt harsh rather than gentle, as though her innocence were being deliberately burned away by the unforgiving scrutiny of daylight. The breakfast tray sat largely untouched despite her efforts, and papers were scattered across her coverlet like fallen leaves, each one a testament to her disgrace, each headline and withdrawal another weight added to the burden she now carried. Anger began to burn through the humiliation like fire-consuming frost, a hot and righteous fury at the Duke for his calculated cruelty, at society for its eagerness to judge and condemn her rather than him, at her own foolish heart for having hoped at all when hope had proved so dangerous. "Perhaps you should rest today, my lady," Mary said gently, her voice carrying the kind of careful concern one uses with the ill or wounded. No callers expected, and you need not face anyone until you are ready. Eleanor lifted her chin with automatic pride and replied with surprising firmness, "No, I will receive anyone who calls. I have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." And even as she spoke, she felt the truth of the words settling into her bones and strengthening her spine. The door opened without warning, and her mother swept in already dressed for the day despite the early hour, her face set in lines of determination that Eleanor had seen before when decisions were being made that would affect the family. "We are leaving for Hartley Manor tomorrow," her mother announced without preamble. "I have instructed the staff to begin packing. We will withdraw from London immediately and wait for this scandal to pass. Perhaps by next season it will be forgotten enough that we might return." Eleanor felt the anger that had been building since she woke flare into something hotter and more defiant, and she met her mother's eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both as she prepared to refuse. At mid-morning, when Eleanor was still arguing with her mother about the proposed retreat to the country, a commotion outside Hartley House drew both women to the window. And what Eleanor saw there made her certain she was hallucinating, or perhaps still asleep and trapped in some fever dream conjured by her overwrought nerves. A massive wagon had stopped directly before their door, piled impossibly high with roses of the deepest crimson she had ever seen, hundreds upon hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, stacked so high that the entire conveyance seemed to overflow with blooms, and footmen in the distinctive black and silver livery of the Duke of Ashford were already beginning the process of unloading this extraordinary cargo. Eleanor stared in complete disbelief as the footman moved with practiced efficiency, lifting enormous arrangements of roses and carrying them toward the entrance of Hartley House, and within moments the first arrangements began arriving in the entrance hall, then more, then still more, until the austere space with its marble floors and classical proportions began to transform into something resembling a bower or perhaps a shrine, every surface covered with crimson blooms. The scent of roses flooded the house with overwhelming intensity, sweet and heady and almost narcotic in its strength, and Eleanor found herself torn between the beauty of it and the sheer absurdity, for this was not a normal gesture of apology but something excessive to the point of madness. Her mother came running from wherever she had gone after their argument, her face a picture of confusion and dawning hope, while the butler stood in the entrance hall looking utterly helpless as the invasion of flowers continued unabated, his usual perfect composure shattered by the unprecedented nature of the situation. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, her anger flaring hot and bright in her chest. For did the Duke of Ashford truly believe he could purchase her forgiveness with flowers? Did he think her so shallow that a grand gesture would erase the calculated cruelty of his public rejection? Did he imagine that she would simply swoon at this display of wealth and forget that he had destroyed her reputation before all of society? Yet beneath the anger, confusion stirred like sediment at the bottom of a clear stream, clouding her certainty. For why would he do this? Why roses, and why so very many of them? Why make such a public spectacle when he could have sent a simple note of apology, or called in person to beg her forgiveness in private? The entrance hall continued its transformation as footmen carried in arrangement after arrangement, and Eleanor noticed with almost detached fascination how the thorns caught on the marble surfaces, leaving small scratches, how petals dropped to the floor like drops of blood, how the overwhelming beauty of it all was almost violent in its excess, as though the Duke were trying to bludgeon her into forgiveness through sheer visual assault. Servants gathered to whisper and stare, their usual discretion forgotten in the face of such extraordinary events. And through the still open door, Eleanor could see that passers-by on the street had stopped to gawk, that a small crowd was forming to witness this spectacle, and she realized with sinking certainty that whatever the Duke intended by this gesture, he had ensured that it would be as public as his original slight. One of the Duke's footmen approached her directly, bowing with perfect formality despite the chaos of flowers surrounding them, and his voice carried the careful neutrality of a well-trained servant delivering a message he knows to be significant. His Grace the Duke of Ashford presents his compliments and begs. Lady Eleanor will accept these tokens of his deepest regret, the footman intoned, as though he were announcing guests at a ball rather than delivering what appeared to be an entire hothouse worth of roses. Eleanor's mother gasped audibly and clutched at Eleanor's arm, her earlier despair apparently forgotten in the face of this development. 1,000 roses, her mother breathed with something approaching awe. There must be nearly that many, and Eleanor found she could not disagree with the estimate, for the entrance hall was now so full of blooms that navigation was becoming difficult. The footman extended a small, cream-colored card, and Eleanor took it with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts at composure, breaking the seal to reveal a message written in bold, masculine handwriting that she recognized from the few notes the Duke had sent during their brief acquaintance. "Forgive me," the card read with devastating simplicity. "I was a fool," and it was signed with nothing more than his title, Ashford, as though his identity required no further explanation. Eleanor stared at the card as the scent of 1,000 roses surrounded her like a physical embrace, and she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again, though whether toward forgiveness or deeper anger she could not yet say. Eleanor read the card once more, her eyes tracing the bold handwriting with its presumptuous simplicity, and then with deliberate precision she crumpled the cream-colored paper in her fist and turned to face the butler, who still stood helplessly amid the sea of crimson blooms that had invaded his orderly domain. "Return every rose to the Duke with my compliments," she instructed, her voice calm and cold as winter ice. "Tell his footman that Lady Eleanor does not accept gifts from the Duke of Ashford. Not today, and not ever." And she watched as the butler's eyes widened slightly in surprise before his professional mask reasserted itself. The butler hesitated for the briefest moment, his gaze sweeping across the entrance hall with its hundreds upon hundreds of roses, and Eleanor could practically see him calculating the sheer logistics of returning such an enormous delivery, the time it would take, the wagons that would be required, the spectacle it would create. But years of training won out over practical concerns, and he bowed his acceptance. "Very good, my lady," he said simply, and began issuing quiet instructions to the footman who had been standing uncertain amid the floral chaos. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom and positioned herself at the window that overlooked the street, watching with grim satisfaction as the process of removal began, each arrangement carried back out through the door with the same care that had brought it in, loaded back onto the wagons that still waited at the curb. The Duke's liveried footmen working with admirable efficiency to undo what they had just accomplished. She felt a fierce pleasure in the rejection, a sense of having seized back some small measure of control in a situation where she had been rendered utterly powerless. For if the Duke of Ashford thought that grand gestures could erase the calculated cruelty of public humiliation, then he was very much mistaken. Yet even as she watched the roses disappear back into the wagons, part of her mind could not help but wonder at the extravagance of it all, for 1,000 roses must have cost a fortune even for a man of the Duke's considerable wealth, and more than that, such a delivery required significant planning and coordination. When had he arranged this, she wondered? Had he placed the order the very night of Almack's after leaving her standing devastated on that ballroom floor? Had he lain awake consumed by guilt and decided that flowers would somehow make amends? Had he truly believed that she would simply accept them and consider the matter closed? The questions circled through her mind like birds seeking a place to land, but she pushed them aside and focused instead on hardening her resolve, on building walls around the confusion and hurt that the roses had unexpectedly stirred, for she would not be bought with blooms, no matter how beautiful or how numerous. The house that had been briefly transformed into something resembling an indoor garden returned gradually to its normal state, the marble floors reappearing as arrangements were removed, the classical proportions of the entrance hall reasserting themselves as the floral invasion was reversed, and Eleanor found that the absence of the roses was almost as startling as their presence had been, as though the space itself had been holding its breath and could now exhale. Scattered petals on the floor were the only evidence that remained, crimson against white marble, and Eleanor knew the maids would sweep them away within the hour, erasing even this small trace of the Duke's gesture. Through her window she could see that London society was watching the spectacle with avid interest, faces appearing at windows across the street, passers-by slowing their pace to observe. And Eleanor knew with certainty that this rejection would be discussed in every drawing-room by afternoon, that the gossip columns would report it tomorrow with the same breathless enthusiasm they had devoted to her humiliation. "Eleanor, are you certain?" Her mother's voice came from the doorway, tentative and worried in equal measure. "The Duke is clearly attempting to make amends. 1,000 roses, Eleanor. Surely that demonstrates the sincerity of his regret." Eleanor turned from the window to face her mother, her expression cold and implacable as stone. 1,000 roses do not erase what he did, Mamma," she said, each word precise and controlled. "He humiliated me before all of London. He destroyed my reputation with deliberate cruelty, and I will not be mollified by flowers no matter how many he sends or how much they cost." Her father appeared behind her mother, his presence unexpected, for he usually avoided what he termed the theatrical dramatics of women, but now he stepped into the room and regarded Eleanor with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Good girl," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of approval that Eleanor had rarely heard directed at her. "Make him work for it." And those 4 words settled into her chest like a benediction, like permission to hold firm in her resolve rather than capitulating to the pressure she knew would come. The next morning, Eleanor found herself standing at her bedroom window earlier than was her custom, telling herself that she was merely enjoying the spring air and had no particular reason for choosing this spot at this hour. But when the wagoners arrived precisely at 10 o'clock bearing another impossible load of roses, she had to acknowledge that some part of her had been expecting them. This time the blooms were white rather than crimson, pure as snow or perhaps as apologies, and there were just as many as the day before, 1,000 perfect white roses that transformed the street outside Hartley House into something resembling a scene from a fairy tale, though whether she was the princess or the villain of this particular story, Eleanor could not yet determine. Again she instructed the butler to refuse them, her voice steady despite the flutter of something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. And again the Duke's footmen, with their black and silver livery, began the process of loading the roses back onto wagons, while a growing crowd of curious onlookers gathered to witness the spectacle. Eleanor watched from her window as people stopped their morning routines to observe, as the crowd grew from a handful to dozens, as carriages slowed to allow their occupants a better view, and she realized with a mixture of horror and fascination that her refusal had become as much a public performance as the Duke's gesture. By afternoon, the entire city seemed to be talking about what the gossip columns had already begun calling the Rose War, the unprecedented conflict between the Duke of Ashford and Lady Eleanor Hartley, and every drawing-room in London buzzed with speculation about how long it could possibly continue and what it all meant. Eleanor felt a flicker of something beyond the anger that had sustained her through the previous day, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. For the Duke was persisting in a way that most men would not. Most gentlemen would have accepted a single rejection as final and moved on to less complicated prospects. But he was proving unexpectedly stubborn. She maintained her resolve with conscious effort, reminding herself of the humiliation at Almack's, of the cruel deliberateness of his public rejection, of the fact that flowers could not undo damage once done, yet she could not deny that she found herself waiting by the window each morning, wondering with reluctant anticipation whether roses would come again and what color they might be. The street outside Hartley House had become a kind of daily theatre where Londoners gathered to watch the unfolding drama, and Eleanor observed with bemused detachment as vendors began appearing to sell refreshments to the crowd, as though the delivery and rejection of roses had become entertainment worthy of an admission price. It was a spectacle in the truest sense, a story that Londoners followed with the same avid interest they might devote to a serialized novel, speculating about the next installment and debating the motivations of the principal characters. And Eleanor found herself simultaneously appalled and oddly flattered by the attention. The weather remained crisp and clear as March settled into its stride, daffodils blooming in the squares and parks, while 1,000 roses arrived daily at Hartley House, only to be returned within the hour, and the juxtaposition of the natural spring flowers with the extravagant hothouse blooms seemed to Eleanor a metaphor for something she could not quite articulate. Her younger sister Beatrice burst into her room that afternoon with the kind of barely contained excitement that only an 18-year-old could muster, her eyes bright with vicarious romance, and her cheeks flushed from having run up the stairs in a manner their mother would have deemed most unladylike. "Eleanor, you are famous," Beatrice exclaimed, dropping onto the bed with complete disregard for her muslin gown. "Everyone is talking about you and the Duke. It is terribly romantic." And Eleanor felt irritation flare at this characterization of what she considered a prolonged insult. "It is not romantic," she snapped with more vehemence than she had intended. "It is absurd. He is being absurd, and I am simply refusing to reward his assumption that I can be bought with flowers." But Beatrice was not so easily deterred, her romantic nature finding nourishment in the very aspects that Eleanor found most troubling. "He must truly care to go to such lengths," Beatrice insisted, leaning forward with the earnest intensity of youth. "No man sends 2,000 roses without deep feeling. Eleanor, perhaps he made a terrible mistake at Almack's, but surely these flowers prove that he regrets it desperately." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to explain that grand gestures were not the same as genuine remorse, that public displays of wealth were not equivalent to private acts of contrition, but she found the words would not come. For some traitorous part of her mind was whispering that perhaps Beatrice had a point. Perhaps no man would go to such extraordinary lengths unless driven by feelings more profound than simple guilt. Retry CP. In his study, James Rothwell sat across the broad mahogany desk from his secretary Mr. Pemberton, a meticulous man of middle years who had managed the Duke's affairs for the better part of a decade, and who now looked distinctly uncomfortable as he presented the accounting ledgers documenting the mounting costs of what the household staff had begun calling the Rose Campaign. "Your Grace," Pemberton began with the careful delicacy of a man delivering unwelcome news, "the expenses are becoming quite substantial, not merely the cost of the roses themselves, though they are considerable given that we are procuring them from hothouses across England, and have even engaged suppliers in France to meet the daily demand, but also the logistics of transportation, the wages for additional footmen, the coordination required to ensure delivery at precisely the same hour each morning." James waved his hand in dismissal before the secretary could continue itemizing costs, the gesture conveying both his lack of concern for the financial implications and his desire to end this particular conversation. "I do not care about the expense," he said flatly. "Order another 1,000 for tomorrow and continue the daily deliveries until I instruct otherwise." And Pemberton bowed his acceptance, though his expression suggested he thought his employer had taken leave of his senses. After the secretary departed, James sat alone staring at the papers scattered across his desk, maps marking the locations of every significant hothouse within a day's journey of London. Schedules detailing the complex choreography required to gather and deliver 1,000 fresh roses each morning, correspondence with flower merchants who had initially thought him mad, but who now competed eagerly for his business, and he acknowledged to himself that this entire enterprise had evolved into something resembling a military campaign. Lord Peter Bancroft arrived without appointment, but also without surprise, for he had been calling daily since the rose deliveries began, driven by a combination of genuine concern for his friend and frank curiosity about how long this extraordinary situation could possibly continue. "You are becoming obsessed, James," Bancroft announced as he settled into the leather chair opposite the desk without waiting for invitation. 3,000 roses, and she has refused them all. Perhaps you should abandon this strategy and call on her personally. Speak with her face to face rather than communicating through flowers. James looked up from the maps and schedules that had consumed his morning and met his friend's eyes with an intensity that made Bancroft shift uncomfortably. "She will not receive me," James stated with absolute certainty. "I destroyed her reputation before all of society. Peter, I humiliated her in the cruelest possible way. She will not grant me a private audience, and I cannot blame her for that. This is the only way I can communicate my sincerity, the only language that might eventually convince her that my regret is genuine." Bancroft studied his friend with the assessing gaze of someone who had known him since their school days at Eton and who could read the subtle signs that others missed. "Or your madness," he suggested with a slight smile, intended to soften the observation, though his eyes remained serious. James felt his own mouth curve in response, a rueful acknowledgement of the truth beneath the jest. "Perhaps they are the same thing," he admitted. "Perhaps there is no meaningful distinction between sincere regret and obsessive determination. Perhaps I have crossed some line where guilt becomes something else entirely." What troubled James most was not the expense or the logistical complexity or even the growing spectacle that his roses had created, but rather the realization that had crept up on him gradually over the past 3 days. The understanding that he was driven not merely by guilt over what he had done, but by something deeper and more dangerous. He was realizing with uncomfortable clarity what he had lost in that moment at Almack's. Not just Eleanor's good opinion or the possibility of a convenient marriage, but the chance to know her, to discover what thoughts lived behind those amber eyes, to understand what combination of strength and grace allowed her to stand so firmly against him when most women would have capitulated after the first delivery. Her refusals intrigued him in ways he had not anticipated, each rejection revealing something about her character that made him more, rather than less, determined to win her forgiveness. And he found himself thinking about her at odd moments throughout the day, wondering what she was doing, whether she was watching from her window when the roses arrived, what expression crossed her face when she ordered them returned. Her strength drew him in despite himself, or perhaps because of himself, for James had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who bent to his will, who agreed with his opinions, who shaped themselves to his preferences, and Eleanor's absolute refusal to do any of those things was as refreshing as it was frustrating. The ordered space of his study had become devoted entirely to this chaotic pursuit, every surface covered with documents related to the rose deliveries, and through the tall windows, morning light illuminated London going about its business, while inside, a duke plotted his campaign with the kind of single-minded focus he had previously reserved for matters of state and estate management. 5,000 roses had now been delivered to Hartley House, and 5,000 roses had been returned to the Duke of Ashford. And Eleanor had begun to feel as though she were trapped in some strange, repeating dream, where each morning brought the same impossible spectacle, and each morning she responded with the same inflexible refusal. Her father sent word through a footman that he wished to speak with her privately in his study, an unusual request that sent a flutter of apprehension through Eleanor's chest, for the Earl of Hartley was not a man given to involving himself in what he termed the emotional theatrics of his household unless something of genuine importance required his attention. She made her way to his study with reluctant steps, wondering what pronouncement he intended to deliver, whether he would side with her mother's demands for immediate retreat to the country, or whether he had some third position that she had not yet considered. The study was exactly as it had always been, masculine and book-lined with the comfortable smell of tobacco and old leather, a globe in the corner that Eleanor had spun countless times as a child, while her father explained the wider world beyond London's drawing rooms, and she felt transported back to her younger self as she settled into the leather chair across from his desk. Rain pattered against the tall windows in a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the seriousness of whatever conversation was about to unfold, and Eleanor could see through the glass that another delivery of roses sat outside, awaiting her inevitable refusal. Today's blooms a delicate pink that reminded her of sunrise, or perhaps of hope, though she pushed that thought aside as soon as it formed. Her father regarded her in silence for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental, and when he finally spoke, his question was not at all what she had expected. "Do you want to forgive him, Eleanor?" he asked with the directness that had always characterized their private conversations. "Or do you want to punish him?" And she must answer honestly, because the distinction matters more than you might think. Eleanor was taken aback by the question, her mouth opening to respond with automatic defiance before she realized that she did not actually know the answer. For she had been so focused on her righteous anger, so consumed by the justified fury of having been wronged, that she had not separated in her mind the desire for justice from the desire for vengeance. She sat in her father's leather chair, feeling suddenly like a child again, uncertain and seeking guidance from the man who had always helped her think through complicated problems with clarity and precision, and his question unsettled her precisely because it forced her to examine motivations she had not yet interrogated. "He wronged you grievously," her father continued, when she did not immediately respond. "No question about that. Eleanor, what he did at Almack's was cruel and calculated, and you have every right to your anger. But 5 days of persistence, 5,000 roses, that suggests something beyond mere social obligation, that suggests genuine contrition." Eleanor found her voice at last, though it came out sharper than she intended. "Or stubbornness," she countered. "Perhaps he simply cannot bear that someone has refused him. Perhaps his pride is wounded, and he wishes to win this contest regardless of any actual feeling." Her father nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of her interpretation. "Perhaps," he agreed, "but consider Eleanor. What does forgiveness actually mean? Must he suffer proportionally to your suffering before you can grant it? And if so, how do you measure when the debt is paid? How many roses equal one public humiliation? How many days of rejection balance one moment of cruelty?" The questions landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through Eleanor's carefully constructed certainty. For she had not considered forgiveness in such concrete terms, had not attempted to quantify what would be sufficient penance, or whether penance was even what she truly sought. "Does he need to feel exactly as terrible as you felt that night at Almack's?" Her father pressed with gentle relentlessness. "Does he need to experience equivalent public shame? And if he does, then no amount of roses will achieve that goal. But if forgiveness means something else, if it means releasing anger because holding it has become more burdensome than the original wrong, then perhaps you need to ask yourself what you are actually protecting by maintaining this position." "I do not know, Papa," Eleanor said quietly, the admission feeling like defeat and relief in equal measure. "I do not know what I want anymore. I thought I wanted him to understand the depth of his cruelty, to see that actions have consequences, and that people cannot simply be discarded when they become inconvenient. But now I find myself waiting each morning to see if roses will come, and feeling strangely disappointed on the mornings when I wake before they arrive, and I do not understand what that means." Her father's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy mixed with recognition, as though he had been waiting for precisely this admission. "That uncertainty," he said gently, "that confusion about your own desires, That is often the first sign that forgiveness is becoming possible, not because the wrong was any less wrong or because sufficient time has passed, but because you are beginning to see the person who wronged you as something more complex than simply the author of your pain. On the 7th day, the roses arrived in a rainbow of color, every shade mixed together in arrangements that seemed to capture light itself. Crimson and white and pink and yellow and coral, all intertwined in a display so breathtakingly beautiful that even Eleanor's carefully maintained anger faltered at the sight. The Duke had varied his approach for the first time since the deliveries began, and this departure from pattern felt significant in ways Eleanor could not immediately articulate, as though he were demonstrating that his commitment was not mere stubborn repetition, but something more thoughtful, more deliberate. With the roses came a new note, longer than the first terse message, and Eleanor broke the seal with fingers that trembled slightly, despite her determination to remain unmoved. "I do not ask you to forget what I did," the note began, in that bold handwriting she was beginning to recognize as easily as her own. "I ask only that you allow me the chance to explain why I was such a coward. If you refuse these roses as you have the others, I will understand. But I will send 1,000 more tomorrow, and every day after, until you believe I mean what I say." And it was signed simply Ashford, as though his title were both identity and confession. Eleanor read the note multiple times, her eyes catching on the word coward with each pass, for the Duke of Ashford had called himself a coward in his own hand, had admitted weakness and fear in a way that proud men rarely did, and the admission surprised her more than all the roses combined. She had expected continued apology, perhaps escalating declarations of regret, but this acknowledgement of his own flawed humanity was something different entirely, something that penetrated the armor of her anger in a way that grand gestures alone could not. The rainbow of roses transformed the entrance hall into something magical and fairy tale-like, as though a garden had somehow grown overnight within the austere marble space, and servants paused in their morning work to admire the display with open wonder, whispering to each other about the Duke's persistence and Lady Eleanor's remarkable resolve. The effect was different from the monochrome displays of previous days, more personal somehow, as though each color had been chosen to convey some specific meaning, and Eleanor found herself wondering what the Duke had thought as he selected them, whether he had personally instructed the florists, or whether he had simply ordered variety without considering the implication. Spring sunshine streamed through the tall windows, illuminating petals with such intensity that they seemed to glow from within, and for the first time since the deliveries began, Eleanor felt her hand hesitate as she reached for the bell to summon the butler. Her fingers hovered in the air while conflicting impulses warred within her chest, the desire to maintain her position against the growing curiosity about what explanation the Duke could possibly offer for his cruelty. And she stood frozen in indecision for what felt like an eternity, though it could only have been moments. She let the roses stay for an hour, telling herself that she was simply enjoying their beauty, that admiring flowers did not constitute forgiveness or even softening, but knowing in her heart that allowing them to remain even temporarily represented a crack in the foundation of her resolve. Beatrice found her standing amid the rainbow of blooms, her sister's face lit with delight at the spectacular display, and she moved through the arrangements with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone too young to understand the complicated emotions they represented. "Eleanor, they are beautiful," Beatrice whispered, as though speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell. "Will you not keep just one? A single rose to acknowledge his effort, if not to forgive his wrong." Eleanor felt torn between her sister's simple logic and her own more complicated feelings, between the desire to hold firm and the exhaustion of maintaining constant anger. "I cannot," she said at last, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried on previous days. Keeping one means I am softening, and I am not ready to soften. Not yet. Not when I still remember so vividly how it felt to stand before all of society and be rejected without cause or explanation. Beatrice looked disappointed, but did not argue further, and Eleanor finally rang for the butler and gave the familiar instruction to return every rose to the Duke, watching from her window as the rainbow was disassembled and loaded back onto wagons, while the daily crowd observed with commentary she could not hear but could easily imagine. Yet after the wagons had departed and the entrance hall had been restored to its normal state, Eleanor descended the stairs and found amid the scattered petals that remained a single bloom that had somehow been overlooked in the removal, deep crimson like the first day's roses, and she picked it up with careful fingers. She told herself she would simply discard it, that one rose meant nothing in the context of 7,000, but instead she carried it to her bedroom and pressed a single petal between the pages of her diary, preserving it there like a secret she was keeping from herself, evidence of a softening she was not yet prepared to acknowledge aloud. Eleanor attended Lady Pemberton's musical on the 8th evening of the rose deliveries with considerable reluctance, knowing she could not indefinitely avoid society without confirming her mother's fears about permanent social ruin, yet dreading the whispers and pitying glances that had followed her since Almack's. What she encountered instead left her bewildered and oddly disoriented, for the opinion of London society had shifted with the characteristic fickleness that made the ton both fascinating and frustrating, transforming her from object of schadenfreude to subject of romantic fascination in the space of a single week. Ladies who had deliberately cut her in the street after her public humiliation now approached her with eager warmth, their eyes bright with curiosity and their questions tumbling over one another in their haste to extract details about the Duke's unprecedented campaign. Eleanor navigated this sudden attention with confusion, uncertain whether she was being honored or merely providing entertainment, and she found herself at the center of every conversation, despite having contributed nothing more than her presence and her continued refusals. The drawing-room at Pemberton House was filled with London's elite, the season's most fashionable gathering of titles and wealth, and piano music provided a genteel backdrop to conversations that kept circling back to the same topic, regardless of how Eleanor attempted to redirect them. Ladies in spring gowns of pastel silk and delicate muslin clustered around her like she had suddenly become the season's most interesting person, their attention a stark contrast to the cold shoulders she had endured immediately after Almack's. And Eleanor recognized with growing unease that society was fickle and followed the best story regardless of truth or justice. "My dear Lady Eleanor," Lady Pemberton herself gushed as she swept across the room, trailing expensive French perfume and barely suppressed excitement. "It is like something from a novel. 1,000 roses every day. How many has it been now? 8,000, I think someone said. The Duke must be utterly devoted to you." Eleanor replied with deliberate coolness, hoping to discourage the romantic interpretation that was rapidly becoming accepted fact. "I have not kept count, as I have refused them all," she said clearly. "Every single rose has been returned to the Duke without exception. There is no romance in flowers that are not accepted." But her correction seemed only to fuel rather than dampen the enthusiasm, as though her refusals were themselves part of the romantic narrative rather than a rejection of it. And she felt control of the story slipping from her hands like water through cupped palms. Another lady leaned forward with the kind of conspiratorial intimacy that society women used when discussing matters they considered deliciously scandalous. "But surely you must forgive him soon," the woman insisted, as though Eleanor's forgiveness were something owed rather than something earned. "Such devotion deserves reward, does it not? No man sends 8,000 roses without the deepest feeling." Eleanor felt her irritation flare at this presumption and replied with more sharpness than was perhaps polite. "Devotion?" she asked with an edge to her voice. "Or guilty conscience? How do you distinguish between a man who loves and a man who simply wishes to assuage his own guilt over cruel behavior?" The question hung in the air for a moment before being swept away by the tide of romantic speculation that seemed to have captured the collective imagination of London's ladies, and Eleanor realized with frustrated clarity that her refusal to forgive was being recast as romantic stubbornness rather than justified anger, as though she were the heroine of some Gothic novel playing hard to win rather than a woman standing firm on principle. She resented this reinterpretation, even as she recognized that her social standing had paradoxically improved rather than deteriorated. For whereas a week ago she had been pitied as the woman rejected by the Duke, now she was envied as the woman for whom the Duke was apparently willing to bankrupt every hothouse in England. The narrative had shifted beneath her feet, and she found herself cast in a role she had not auditioned for, no longer the victim of public humiliation, but the prize in some grand romantic gesture, and she was uncertain whether this represented progress or simply a different form of objectification. Throughout the evening she heard fragments of conversation that revealed how thoroughly the story had taken hold of society's imagination. Ladies discussing the Duke's persistence with the same breathless enthusiasm they might devote to the latest sensation novel, gentlemen placing wagers in their clubs about how many days Eleanor would hold out before capitulating, everyone treating the entire situation as entertainment rather than the complicated tangle of hurt and pride and confusion that Eleanor knew it to be her. The warmth of society's attention contrasted so sharply with the cold shoulders after Almack's that Eleanor felt she had stepped through some invisible boundary into an alternate reality where the rules had changed without warning, and she struggled to maintain her equilibrium in the face of this unexpected shift. A young lady barely out of the schoolroom approached with stars in her eyes and declared that Eleanor was the luckiest woman in London to have captured the heart of the most eligible duke in England, and Eleanor had to bite her tongue against the reply that she had not captured anything, that she had been publicly humiliated and was now being publicly pursued, and that neither situation had much to do with her own desires or agency. She left the musicale earlier than politeness strictly required, pleading a headache that was not entirely fabricated, and in the carriage home she found herself reviewing the evening with mounting frustration, for she realized that society's transformation of her humiliation into romance had created a new form of pressure, an expectation that she would eventually soften and accept the Duke's suit because that was what the story demanded, and refusal to do so would cast her as the villain rather than him. With the 12,000 roses came something different, a sealed letter thick with pages that the Duke's footman presented to Eleanor with unusual solemnity, explaining that His Grace hoped Lady Eleanor would read it even if she refused the flowers, as she had refused all the others. Eleanor took the letter with hands that betrayed her composure by trembling slightly, the weight of the folded pages feeling substantial in her palm, and she gave her customary instruction to return the roses, though her voice lacked the firmness it had carried in previous days. She climbed to her bedroom with the letter clutched against her chest, her heart beating with an intensity that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the stairs, and once safely behind her closed door, she found herself staring at the sealed packet as though it might contain either salvation or damnation, and she could not predict which. For hours she debated with herself, the letter sitting on her dressing table like an unexploded munition while twilight deepened into evening and candles were lit against the gathering dark, and she invented a dozen reasons why she should not read it, why opening it would represent a weakening of her resolve, why whatever excuse the Duke offered could not possibly justify his cruelty. Yet curiosity gnawed at her with persistent teeth, eroding the certainty she had maintained for nearly 2 weeks, and finally, As rain began to streak the windows, she could bear it no longer. She curled into the window seat overlooking the street where tomorrow's roses would inevitably arrive, drawing her knees up beneath her skirts like a child seeking comfort, and broke the seal with fingers that trembled more obviously now that there was no one to witness her agitation. The letter was long, written in the Duke's bold handwriting that covered page after page in lines of black ink that seemed to pulse with urgency, and Eleanor read it once quickly, her eyes racing over the words in her haste to understand, then again more slowly as the full weight of what he was confessing settled over her like a physical burden. "Lady Eleanor," the letter began without preamble or elaborate greeting, "I owe you an explanation, though it excuses nothing I have done, and what follows is not an attempt to justify my behavior, but merely to provide context that you deserve to have, even if you choose to do nothing with it. 3 years ago I was engaged to Lady Caroline Ashworth, the daughter of the Marquis of Pembroke, and I believed myself in love with all the naive certainty of a young man who has never truly been tested. 1 week before our wedding I returned unexpectedly early from a business matter in the country and discovered her in a compromising position with my own brother, my younger brother, whom I had trusted absolutely, and the double betrayal shattered something fundamental in me that I do not think has ever properly healed." Eleanor felt her breath catch as she read this revelation, her mind immediately conjuring the scene the Duke must have witnessed, the devastation he must have felt, and despite her anger, she found unwelcome sympathy stirring in her chest. The letter continued in that same direct style, each sentence laying bare wounds that Eleanor suspected the Duke had never before put into words. "I vowed that day never to be vulnerable again, never to care too deeply or trust too completely, never to give anyone the power to hurt me as I had been hurt. And I constructed walls around my heart with such determination that I convinced myself they were wisdom rather than cowardice. When I met you, Lady Eleanor, when I found myself drawn to your wit and warmth, when I realized that you made me laugh in a way I had not laughed since before that terrible discovery, I panicked in the most profound sense of the word." The Duke's handwriting seemed to press harder into the paper at this point, the letters darker as though emotion had translated into physical force. "I convinced myself that I was being honorable by severing our acquaintance publicly and definitively, that a clean break would prevent false hope and save us both from greater pain down the road. That decisive action was better than allowing expectations to develop that I could never fulfill. Instead, I became the very thing I despised, someone who inflicts pain to protect himself, someone who wounds the innocent because he has been wounded, someone who mistakes cruelty for strength." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she read, her anger complicated now by understanding though not yet dissolved, and the pages rustled in her hands as though they too were trembling with the weight of confession. "You deserved honesty in private, not cruelty in public," the letter went on. "You deserved to be told that my fear prevented me from pursuing you further, not to be rejected before all of society, as though you were somehow unworthy when the unworthiness was entirely mine. I cannot undo what I did, Eleanor. I cannot take back the words or erase the humiliation, but I can spend however long it takes proving that I see my error, that I recognize the profound difference between protecting oneself and destroying another. The roses are not payment, for they could never be sufficient. They are penance and promise, proof that I will persist in demonstrating my regret until you believe it genuine." The letter concluded with simply his initials rather than his title, J.R., as though he were writing not as the Duke of Ashford, but as James Rothwell, merely a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and hoped desperately for forgiveness he knew he had not earned. Eleanor did not sleep that night, could not sleep, for every time she closed her eyes she saw the words of the Duke's letter written across the darkness of her eyelids, like accusations or perhaps confessions, and she found herself pacing the length of her bedroom with restless energy that had nowhere else to go. She reread the letter so many times that she began to memorize passages without intending to, phrases about betrayal and fear, and walls built for protection that became prisons. And with each reading, her understanding shifted slightly, like a kaleidoscope turning to reveal new patterns in familiar fragments. The candles burned down slowly as the night progressed, their flames guttering and reforming in the drafts that crept through even the best-maintained townhouse. And Eleanor watched the wax pool and drip with the same fascinated detachment she might have given to watching her own certainty melt away. She thought about betrayal, about what it must have felt like to discover the woman you loved and the brother you trusted in that terrible moment of revelation, and she recognized with uncomfortable honesty that such a wound would not heal cleanly or quickly, that it would leave scars that shaped all future choice. She thought about fear and the walls people build to protect themselves, and in this thinking she recognized something of herself in the Duke's confession. For had she not also been afraid of vulnerability, of hoping too much, of allowing herself to believe that someone might truly want her for herself, rather than for her family connections or her father's modest fortune? The realization unsettled her because it complicated the neat division she had maintained between his wrongdoing and her righteousness, introducing shades of grey into what she had preferred to see as stark black and white. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky from black to grey to the pale pink of early morning, Eleanor was exhausted in body and spirit, but had reached no firm conclusion except that her anger was more complicated now, layered with understanding that she had not possessed before and could not simply dismiss. She wanted to hold on to her righteous indignation because it had been her armor these past 12 days, the thing that kept her upright and resolute when society's opinion shifted like sand beneath her feet. But the Duke's honesty had penetrated that armor in a way that flowers alone could not. She found herself thinking of the crimson petal pressed between the pages of her diary, that small secret acknowledgement that something in her had already begun to soften, and she wondered when exactly that softening had started, whether it was the rainbow roses or the word coward in his first long note, or some earlier moment she had not recognized as significant. She thought of 12,000 roses, of the extraordinary persistence required to maintain such a campaign, of the planning and expense and sheer stubborn determination it represented, and she asked herself whether a man who cared nothing beyond assuaging his guilt would truly go to such lengths. The word coward echoed in her mind, and she considered how much courage it must have taken for the proud Duke of Ashford to admit weakness, to acknowledge fear, to lay bare wounds he had clearly never before revealed, and that courage of confession moved her in ways the roses themselves had not. She was not ready to forgive, she told herself firmly as she stood at her window watching London wake below, not ready to simply absolve him of the pain he had caused, or to pretend that public humiliation could be erased by private explanation, but neither was she certain she wanted to refuse forever, to hold on to anger until it turned bitter and consumed her from within. "What do I want?" She spoke aloud to her empty room, her voice sounding strange after hours of silence, revenge or justice, or just to not hurt anymore, to not carry this weight of humiliation and wounded pride like a stone in my chest. The question hung in the air unanswered, because Eleanor did not know the answer, had perhaps never known it, and she realized that her father had been right when he asked whether she wanted to forgive or to punish. She picked up the letter again, though she could have recited most of it from memory by now, and ran her finger over the signature at the bottom, just initials J and R, as though the Duke could not bear to write his full name or title, as though he were signing as simply a man rather than as the powerful peer who had wronged her. "James Rothwell," she whispered to the empty room. Who are you really? Are you the cruel man who rejected me at Almack's, or the wounded man who wrote this letter? Or are you somehow both at once? And if you are both, then which version do I respond to?" Outside her window she could hear London coming to life, vendors calling their wares in the streets below, carriages beginning to rattle over cobblestones, the city shaking off sleep and preparing for another day. And Eleanor knew with weary certainty that another 1,000 roses would arrive within the hour, that the pattern would continue unless she took some action to alter it. The house was silent around her. That peculiar quiet of early morning, when servants were just beginning to stir, but the family still slept. And in that silence, Eleanor felt the full weight of the decision that awaited her. For she could not remain suspended in this liminal space forever, refusing but softening, angry but understanding, hurt but curious about the man behind the flowers. When the 15,000 roses arrived in the pale pink of dawn, or perhaps of new beginnings, Eleanor stood at her window as she had every morning for the past 2 weeks and watched the familiar wagons roll to a stop before Hartley House. But this time, when the footmen began their well-practiced routine of unloading, she did not immediately reach for the bell to summon her butler. She stood motionless for a long moment, her hand hovering in the air as though suspended by invisible strings, while some invisible battle was fought and won within her chest. And then, with sudden decision, she turned from the window and descended the stairs to the entrance hall, where roses were already beginning to accumulate. She did something she had not done in 15 days. She allowed them to remain, instructed the butler with a voice that trembled only slightly that these flowers were to be kept and arranged throughout the house, and watched as surprise and poorly concealed delight crossed the faces of servants who had spent 2 weeks loading and unloading identical cargo. Eleanor did not acknowledge the roses publicly, did not send thanks or any message of acceptance, but the simple act of allowing them to stay felt momentous in a way that made her heart pound against her ribs like something trying to escape. She retreated to her father's study and took up pen and paper, staring at the blank page for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, composing and discarding a dozen versions of what she wanted to say before finally settling on brevity. "Your Grace," she wrote in her careful, slanting hand, "I have read your letter. I will keep today's roses. This is not forgiveness, but it is acknowledgement." And she signed it simply E.H., as he had signed his letter with only initials, a small mirror of his vulnerability that cost her more than she wanted to admit. She sealed the note and sent it via footman to the Duke's residence in Grosvenor Square before she could second-guess herself. And as she watched the servant depart, she felt simultaneously like she had taken control of the situation, and like she had surrendered something precious she could never reclaim. The roses were pale pink like dawn, or like the blush on a young girl's cheeks, delicate and lovely, and filling the entrance hall with a fragrance that was somehow less overwhelming than the deeper colors had been, more subtle and therefore more insidious in the way it wound itself through the house. Eleanor walked among the arrangements that servants were placing on every available surface, trailing her fingers over petals that felt like silk beneath her gloves, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, as though a fist that had been clenched tight for 2 weeks had begun to uncurl. Fear and hope warred within her in equal measure. Fear that she was being foolish, and hope that perhaps she was being brave, and she could not yet determine which emotion would ultimately triumph. The Hartley entrance hall was finally allowed to keep its transformation after 15 days of temporary beauty immediately undone, and servants sepulchred as they arranged roses in crystal vases and porcelain bowls, clearly pleased that their mistress had softened, even if she would not admit to softening, and their pleasure added to the sense that something significant had shifted. The scent was overwhelming in the best possible way, beautiful and heady and impossible to ignore. And Eleanor found that she kept returning to the entrance hall throughout the morning, on various invented errands, simply to walk among the flowers and remind herself that they were real and that she had chosen to keep them. Outside, the watching crowd that had gathered faithfully every morning for 2 weeks erupted in cheers when the Duke's wagons departed empty for the first time, understanding immediately what the empty wagons signified, and Eleanor heard the noise from inside the house, and felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and something else she could not quite name. The story that all of London had been following like a serialized novel had acquired a new chapter, and Eleanor knew that by afternoon every drawing room in the city would be discussing her capitulation or perhaps her mercy, debating what it meant and what would happen next. Spring had fully arrived while Eleanor had been consumed by the daily ritual of rejection, and now London was blooming with daffodils and early roses in gardens and window boxes, the entire city seeming to celebrate the season of renewal just as Eleanor allowed the first small possibility of her own renewal. Beatrice found her standing among the pale pink roses in the entrance hall, and her sister's face was alight with excitement and vindication, the expression of someone who has been proven right after arguing a position for weeks. "You kept them," Beatrice exclaimed, as she rushed down the stairs with complete disregard for the dignified dissent their mother had drilled into them. "Oh, Eleanor, does this mean you will see him? Will you receive him if he calls? Have you forgiven him?" Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her lips, despite her best efforts at maintaining dignity. "It means I am tired of returning flowers," she replied with deliberate coolness, nothing more than that. "Beatrice, do not read romance into simple exhaustion." Her sister laughed with the uncomplicated delight of someone who sees clearly what others try to hide. "You are the worst liar, sister," Beatrice declared. "I can see it in your face that this means something, that something has changed," and Eleanor found she could not maintain her facade in the face of such direct observation. "Perhaps," she admitted with a reluctant smile that felt like the first genuine expression of pleasure she had allowed herself in weeks. "Perhaps something has changed, but I do not yet know what it means or where it will lead, only that I could not continue refusing forever without becoming something bitter and small." James Rothwell was reviewing estate ledgers in his study when the footman returned from Hartley House bearing Eleanor's note, and he took the folded paper with hands that began to shake before he had even broken the seal. For the simple fact that she had sent a reply at all was more than he had allowed himself to expect. He dismissed the footman with an absent wave and stared at the cream-colored paper for a long moment before finally opening it, his heart beating with an intensity that would have embarrassed him had anyone been present to witness it, and when he read the brief message, his vision actually blurred with relief so profound it felt physical. "She kept the roses," the words repeated in his mind like a litany or perhaps a prayer. After 15 days of rejection, she kept them. She kept them. She kept them. He read the note 10 times in rapid succession, analyzing every word as though it were a legal document requiring close interpretation, lingering over each phrase and trying to extract maximum meaning from minimal text. "Your Grace suggested formality, but not the complete coldness of previous interactions. I have read your letter confirmed that his confession had reached her, and presumably affected her in some way. I will keep today's roses was the most significant statement, and the one that made his hands continue their trembling. And this is not forgiveness, but it is acknowledgement, was both disappointment and possibility wound together in a single sentence. Not forgiveness, he acknowledged to himself with ruthless honesty, but acknowledgement was more than he had dared hope for after 2 weeks of implacable refusal. Acknowledgement meant she had read his letter and had been moved enough by it to alter her position, however slightly. Acknowledgement meant the door he had slammed shut at Almack's and